You are listening to Wraithshollow Chronicles, House Under the Ash, Chapter 1, The Silent Threshold. I returned to Wraithshollow on a wind that smelled like wet timber and old smoke. My father, Elias, had risen before dawn as always, yet the house met me with a silence that did not belong to any hour. Under the threshold, a neat ribbon of ash lay as if poured from a careful hand. I asked if the stove had burned too hot in the night. Father only frowned and said the stove was cold as a church floor. When I stepped across the line, the boards under my boots breathed once and then seemed to hold their breath. The windows had that faint gray film which comes after a fire, though we had not seen flame for months. I opened my journal to note this trifling oddity, and the page felt cool, as if it had been kept in a cellar. Father muttered that ash creeps through every crack in old houses, but even his voice sounded trimmed, as if some tail of sound had been cut off. I knelt and pinched the powder. It held no scent of resin, no hearth's comfort, only a dry chill, like the taste of a thought about winter. From the back room came the measured clicks of my father's tools, and even those arrived thinner, like insects trapped behind glass. I wrote, "The house is quieter than wood deserves." The ink settled cleanly, but the final dot at the end of the sentence never quite appeared. By the next evening, Father had brought something in from the old shed, a narrow wooden box, its brass fittings dulled to the color of a dying ember. He said he found it behind a wall beam, sealed in pitch as if someone meant to hide it from air. The box was neither heavy nor light. Its weight seemed to wander, depending on who held it. I placed it on the workbench, and the tools nearby shifted slightly, aligning their handles toward it like compass needles. The wood was darker than walnut, slick to the touch, and it carried no scent of resin or rot. Father thought it might be a piece from the old Pike estate, the one that burned before I was born. I asked whether we should open it, but the question hung oddly still, as though the air forgot to carry it. Father's hand hesitated on the latch, a carpenter doubting his own hinge. When the clasp yielded, it did so without sound, like a door swinging open in a dream. Inside lay an oval mirror, framed in brass with veins of black patina running through it. It caught the lamplight, yet returned nothing. Not a gleam, not a shimmer, not even the ghost of my face. It was as if the glass had chosen to remember darkness, and nothing else. I set the lamp closer, expecting the brass to flare and the glass to answer with even the faintest echo of light. Instead, the flame dimmed, as though it recoiled from its own reflection. Father said it was only soot between the panes, a craftsman's fault, yet his voice carried no conviction. The surface was perfectly smooth, yet looking at it too long gave the impression of great depth. An endless well filled not with darkness, but with the absence of seeing. I held my hand above the mirror. The skin caught the warmth of the lamp, but its shadow did not appear. It was like standing before an unpainted portrait, space awaiting something that had already decided not to arrive. Father crossed himself quietly, though I had never seen him pray over furniture or glass. When I blinked, the lamp flame shivered, and for an instant I thought the mirror breathed. Not like lungs filling, but like old timber settling after long years of silence. The room thickened, air heavier than smoke. I closed the lid of the box, though I was certain it would open itself again. That night I dreamed of a windowless wall that remembered every face except my own. At dawn I found Father standing by the open box, staring into the mirror, as if listening rather than looking. He said nothing when I entered, but his breath misted faintly in the cold air, then halted, hanging halfway between him and the glass. The vapor coiled once, lost its form, and disappeared without touching the surface. I felt a pull in my chest, the briefest sense that the air was thinner near the box. Father shut it with a snap, like a man trapping a thought before it speaks aloud. We set it aside, yet for the rest of the morning a pale chill lingered where it had stood. When I tried to record the event, the ink lightened and the edges of my letters dissolved, as though the page forgot what black was. I rewrote the same line 3 times, each faded faster than the last. Outside, the frost on the window melted into the pattern of a palm pressed against glass. Father said nothing, only placed his tools neatly in a row, though one chisel was missing and neither of us wished to look for it. I left the page unfinished, unwilling to test how far the forgetting might reach. By evening, the box felt heavier, though neither of us had touched it. The next morning, the house felt colder, though the hearth lay black and untouched. The chill had no dampness to it. It was the kind of cold that belongs to thought rather than season. Father blamed the cracks in the mortar, but frost had formed only along the box's hinges, tracing them in delicate white veins. When I brushed a finger across the metal, the frost did not melt. It crumbled dry like salt left in the sun. I looked to the window, expecting to see our breath upon the glass, but it remained clear as if refusing proof of our being there. Father struck a match to light the lamp. The flame bent away from the mirror's direction, shivering in protest. The sound of the strike came half a heartbeat late, as though the air hesitated to carry it. I wrote these observations down, but the words felt hollow, lighter than they should have been. Even the ink dried too quickly, as if time around the desk moved faster. From the corner of my eye, I saw a faint shimmer crawling along the floorboards, like moonlight learning to walk. When I turned, nothing remained, only that same dry frost creeping outward from the box. Father closed his coat and said he could no longer tell where warmth was supposed to begin. Father decided the mirror should be taken to the shed, far from the hearth and the living rooms. We carried the box together, and as we crossed the threshold, the house exhaled, then fell utterly still. Our boots struck the floor, but no sound answered. Even the boards seemed to forget their own creak. It felt as though we walked inside a bell made of snow, every noise absorbed before it could exist. The latch on the front door clicked without echo, a movement seen rather than heard. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words never left. My own voice dissolved against my teeth. Father gestured sharply for silence, though there was nothing left to silence. When we reached the yard, the frost along the box had spread to our gloves, leaving pale prints that refused to fade. The shed welcomed us with its familiar smell of resin and dust. Yet even there, the quiet followed like breath, held too long. We placed the mirror on a workbench beneath the rafters. A single beam of winter light struck the brass rim and vanished. Father muttered something about sealing the box again, but the sentence died midway, unfinished in the air. I remember the stillness after. It had a weight, like an unspoken word pressing on the chest. That night, I wrote late, eager to fix the day before it slipped from memory. Yet the words refused to stay where I placed them. Lines I had written an hour earlier grew pale at the edges, as if soaked in invisible light. When I traced them again, the new ink thinned, following the same slow erasure. It was not smudging. The parchment itself seemed to drink what it should preserve. Father said the chill was making me careless, but when he leaned closer, even his shadow looked uncertain on the page. The margins crept inward, the text tightening like a wound closing. By the time I reached the bottom, the upper half of the entry had already faded into cream. I tried to recall the first sentence I had written, but the thought dissolved midway, leaving only the rhythm of handwriting without meaning. I felt a numbness behind my eyes, the kind that comes when one stares too long into bright emptiness. From the shed came the faintest tremor, a single shift of wood as if the bench exhaled. I closed the journal, not out of fear, but because the silence around the ink had begun to listen. Father turned to work the next morning, saying that movement keeps the mind straight. The shed filled with the clean rhythm of his chisel, steady, precise, almost comforting. For a while, the sound seemed to mend the air itself, stitching gaps in the stillness. I joined him, marking the timber with pencil lines, grateful for any task that felt ordinary. But after a few strokes, I noticed the rhythm shifting. His blows were echoing faintly, as though answered by another, slower hand. Father paused. The echo stopped a heartbeat later, matching his hesitation. He tried again, and so did it, always a fraction behind. We both looked toward the bench where the mirror rested, its brass rim catching no light. The air in the shed quivered slightly, like thin parchment before tearing. Father muttered that houses remember their builders, though the words carried the tremor of disbelief. When he struck once more, the echo returned alone, without its source. It ended not in sound, but in a hush so exact it felt rehearsed. By midday, Father had gone to the fields, leaving me alone with the quiet. I sat by the bench, watching the faint frost still clinging to the box, unwilling to melt. The mirror lay uncovered, its surface dull yet expectant, as though listening. I leaned closer, not to see myself, but to confirm that it reflected nothing at all. There was no distortion, no blur, only absence so pure it became a kind of focus. The longer I looked, the more it felt as if something beyond the glass was looking back, measuring how much of me it could hold. A pulse passed through the air, subtle but sure, like the slow draw of breath in a sleeping creature. My reflection never appeared, but a dim shimmer rose from the rim, devouring the faint dust of the shed's light. It wasn't brightness, it was consumption, the light thinning as if swallowed. I stepped back, heart quick, though no fear accompanied it. Only the sense of being observed by hunger itself. From outside came the call of a crow, sharp and real, and for a moment the shed remembered sound. When I turned again, the mirror had gone still, and I could swear it looked satisfied. When Father returned, dusk was already creeping through the rafters. He found me still seated by the mirror, notebook open but blank. I told him nothing of the shimmer. There was no need. The air itself bore the memory. We stood side by side, our reflections absent, two silhouettes erased before being drawn. Then, faintly, a pattern emerged within the glass. Not an image, but a suggestion of form. It was the outline of the room inverted, a pale echo where the darker beams should have been. The space we occupied had become hollow inside the reflection, while the emptiness gleamed. Father moved his hand before it. The mirrored air delayed his motion, responding a heartbeat too late. He cursed softly, though his voice came back thinner, folded upon itself. I wanted to write what I saw, but my pencil would not darken the page, as though the lead refused to remember shape. The longer we stared, the clearer it grew. The mirror was mapping us in reverse, tracing the absence we left behind. When Father reached out to close the box, his hand seemed smaller, as if the reflection had taken a measure it intended to keep. That night, I returned to my journal, determined to capture at least the facts of what had passed. I began with a date, then wrote my father's name, Elias Whitmore. Before I could finish the next line, the letters of his name began to thin, their edges paling like ink diluted with milk. I pressed harder, carving the words into the page, but the parchment resisted, the quill catching on unseen grain. When I blinked, the name was gone, leaving behind a faint smudge shaped like the thought of a word. I tried again, and again it vanished, never blotting, only erasing itself with unsettling grace. Father called from the hall, asking whom I spoke to, and I realized I had been whispering his name aloud. The sound felt brittle, almost foreign on my tongue, as though I were reciting something I had learned from a dream. A strange conviction came over me that the mirror was listening through the walls, attentive to every syllable. I closed the book and whispered Elias one last time, just to hear it exist. The silence that followed was too clean, as if the air had swallowed the word whole. When I reopened the page, only the pressure of the quill remained, a hollow impression, an empty signature of memory. The next day, the house felt suspended, as though time itself had forgotten its proper sequence. The old clock above the hearth still moved. Its pendulum swayed, but no sound followed. I leaned close. The brass weights rose and fell in perfect rhythm, yet the tick was missing, replaced by a hush that seemed deliberate. Father claimed it was the oil in the gears, but his words stretched oddly, as if slowed between syllables. When he walked across the floorboards, the creaks came late, arriving half a breath after his step. Outside, the wind bent the branches, but they did not rustle, motion without consequence, as though the world had been muted for rehearsal. I sat beside the clock, feeling the empty beat against my ribs, a ghost rhythm that tried to sync with my pulse. For a moment, I imagined the mirror breathing in time with it, drawing in silence, exhaling erasure. Father laughed once, a short, dry sound that startled both of us, for it ended too soon, truncated by something unseen. I asked what was wrong, but the question left my mouth before my ears could receive it. He touched the pendulum gently, and it stopped mid-swing, obedient to a rule older than mechanics. That was when I understood. The house had begun to count in a different measure, one that no longer required sound. I had promised myself not to look into the mirror again, yet promises are fragile when silence grows too deep. That evening, while Father mended a broken chair, I uncovered the box and lifted the lid. The air above the glass was colder, though not unpleasant, more like the hush before snowfall. At first I saw nothing, only that same flat refusal to reflect. Then the edges began to pulse faintly, a dim, trembling light that had no source. It wasn't brightness, but an imitation of sight, as though the mirror remembered what seeing used to mean. I leaned closer, close enough to hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and the rhythm faltered. For a moment the surface shifted, not revealing a face but the idea of one, unfinished, waiting for permission. The pupils formed last, two hollows where attention should live. Something deep in me recognized that they were not mine. I blinked, and the mirror fell still, returning to its dull and perfect calm. When Father asked later why I looked pale, I said only that the air had been thin. Father began measuring the beams again, insisting that a proper rhythm of work keeps disorder away. He struck the wood with his mallet, counting softly under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Between each count, the air seemed to echo faintly, adding its own uninvited beat. I watched as he paused, adjusted, and struck again. The delay repeated perfectly, as if the room itself remembered the tempo. The pattern became unsettling. Our tools, our steps, even the slow drip from the roof joined into a single cadence. It was too precise to be coincidence, too hollow to be comfort. Father muttered that a house learns its owner's rhythm, but his eyes avoided the mirror's direction. When I touched one of the beams, the wood was vibrating, imperceptibly, like the residue of a sound that no longer existed. I tapped once more. Something beneath the floor responded, the same rhythm in reverse. It was not echo, but imitation, measure, and countermeasure, as if we were being copied, practiced. Father stopped at once, lowering his tools, and whispered that the house was working with us now. I thought the same, but what unsettled me was how well it had learned. That night, Father suggested we eat in the shed. It was warmer there than in the house. He set the small table by the bench, and I fetched 2 plates from the cupboard inside. When I returned, the table was already laid. A loaf of bread, a folded cloth, and a third plate I hadn't carried. The arrangement was exact, precise, down to the knife resting slightly askew, just as it had been a week earlier. Father stared at it without speaking. I saw his jaw tighten, the rhythm of his breath breaking. He said nothing, only brushed the rim of the third plate with his thumb, as if confirming it was solid. I remembered that a week ago, before we found the box, we had eaten here exactly like this. Same plates, same knife. Even the crumbs matched the pattern I recalled brushing away. When I touched the cloth, it was cold, though the rest of the shed was warm with lamplight. I dared to lift the extra plate. Beneath it was a faint circle of dust, perfect and untouched. It felt less like a memory returned than a copy printed on air. Father whispered that some meals are not meant to be repeated and took his food standing. Father spoke little after that night. He worked longer hours, as though labor itself could drown the quiet growing between us. The mirror remained in the shed, covered with a cloth that never gathered dust. Sometimes, when he thought I wasn't watching, Father would lift one corner and whisper something too low to hear. His words didn't sound like prayer. They sounded like accounting, the slow reckoning of a debt. I asked him once what he thought the mirror wanted. He said only that every gift we take from the world has a hidden cost. But we've taken nothing, I replied, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure. He smiled without humor, saying that time itself was a kind of theft, and houses keep their own ledgers. That night I found his notebook open on the table, the ink still wet, the last line unfinished. It read, "The balance demands a memory in return." In the margin, a faint handprint had appeared, smaller than his, marked in gray like frost. When I touched it, the page felt warm, as though payment had already begun. I tried to finish Father's note the next morning, but my hand hesitated where his had stopped. The ink caught and spread thin, forming a line that refused to end. It wasn't a blot, more a thought stretched beyond grammar, a sentence too long for sense. I felt the impulse to complete it, to give it closure, but every word I considered felt stolen from somewhere else. Outside, the air hung still, and even the crows kept their distance from the roof. When I looked back down, the unfinished line had lengthened by itself, bending gently across the margin. The quill remained dry, yet the trace gleamed, wet and deliberate. I could almost read it, not letters, but motion, like the rhythm of Father's hammer carved into language. Then it stopped abruptly. Not because it was done, but because it chose to stop. The silence afterward pressed against me, like breath held too long in a sealed room. In that quiet, I realized it wasn't Father's writing anymore. It was the house continuing his thought. I closed the notebook, leaving the sentence open as he must have intended. It was near dusk when the knocking came. 3 slow raps, each spaced too evenly to be casual. Father opened the door before I could rise, and there stood Pastor Silas Holla, his coat pale with road dust. He said he had dreamt of our house, of a window that refused to show what stood before it. Father did not invite him in. The man entered anyway, like one already expected by the silence. He carried no Bible, only a small case wrapped in cloth and tied with string. "I came," he said, "because forgetting gathers here like snow. You must not let it settle." The words seemed rehearsed, and I wondered whether he was speaking to us or to the air itself. When he crossed the threshold, the house gave a faint creak, the first sound it had made in days. His eyes moved toward the shed before he had even seen it, as though memory pulled him there. Father asked nothing, and Pastor offered no blessing. He simply placed his case on the table and waited. Inside, I heard something shift, perhaps the mirror, acknowledging a familiar presence. For the first time, I felt that what lived in our house might have been waiting for him. Not for us. The pastor asked for no supper, only a place where the walls met bare wood. Father led him to the shed, though he seemed reluctant to cross its threshold. There, beneath the central beam, Silas knelt and drew a small circle in chalk, whispering as he worked. His words were not prayer, but instruction, an invocation of memory, a command for wood to remember its form. He opened his cloth case and removed 3 nails, blackened with age, each inscribed with a letter I could not read. "Old timber forgets slowly," he murmured, "but it can be reminded of its burden." He drove the nails into the beam in a perfect triangle. Each strike sounded distant, like thunder buried under earth. With every blow, the air trembled, and the mirror on the bench began to hum faintly, though no wind moved. Father stepped back, clutching his coat, while the pastor's voice rose and broke on something unseen. For a moment, the hum turned to a gasp. Then silence fell, clean and total. The chalk circle cracked, and one of the nails pulsed with dull red light before fading to ash. Silas opened his eyes and said quietly, "Something listened, but it did not agree." Father brought the mirror to the shed and placed it carefully on the bench beneath the hanging lamp, moving with a stillness that made the whole room feel as though it were holding its breath for him. I followed a few steps behind, unsure whether he wanted my presence or whether I simply feared leaving him alone with that object. He touched the wooden frame first, sliding his thumb along it, as if evaluating its texture for the first time in years. Then, he laid his palm flat against the surface, and the mirror remained empty, offering neither reflection nor even the faintest shimmer of acknowledgement. The lamp flame stretched into a narrow line, trembling once before settling into a rigid shape that looked more like a drawn mark than a living fire. I whispered his name, or thought I did, but the sound never formed, swallowed by a kind of silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. For a long moment, we were 2 figures in a room that no longer behaved like a room, held between breath and the absence of breath. Then the space beside me changed in a way I could not follow, not fading or breaking, but simply no longer containing the outline it had always known. On the boards at my feet lay a scatter of ash, fine and pale, as if shaped not by heat but by a thought abandoned before it could settle. I knelt and gathered it into my hands, and even then it felt lighter than dust, lighter than anything that could claim the weight of a life. When I raised my head, the mirror still showed only the hollow outline of my hands, cupped together as though waiting to receive something they had already lost. And in that faint, unwilling reflection, I understood that the house had chosen to keep what he could no longer carry.